you're just tuning in, this is Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Radio, right? And we also have Jack Dapper Blues Heritage podcast that I record with Brooklyn Blues Organization at Brick Media Arts Center in Brooklyn, New York. This is our live broadcast right now, Monday through Friday, and from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we work to raise funds to build our own online radio station, not show, station, which will feature this show, of course. Now, we have a great guest, a recurring guest for that matter, because he's been on the line with me before during I believe the tail end of fundraising or the premiering of a great documentary. But now we're discussing, we discussed one of his audio book of the time, but now we're discussing his new book. And if any of you don't know, this guy has made harmonica blues a craft. You know, it's beyond a culture, tradition, and experience. It's a craft. That means something given to you by God, and you work it until it's a craft. And I've seen this dude perform live. He's not a joke. Brother Adam Gussow, what's going on?
Man, thank you. I didn't want to interrupt, you know, when the words flow out like that, and they're all good words, I just want to let it flow. That's right. You saw me a couple of years back down in like the Village when my Blues Doctors duo came and did a thing. Although I'm no longer living in New York, I'm living down in Mississippi. We were sort of in town and were available to do that sort of New York Blues Festival, and that was fun. I did not know that it was you in the front row. I would have said hi at that point. We were just becoming friends at that point. So
yes, well, there was a lot going on, and we were just amazed because at the time, Denise and I saw a lot of videos of you, but then when we got to see you in person, it was amazing. You know, we were sitting there with Marie, who is Larry Griffith's manager and PR person. Yeah. And sitting there with her, we all were just like, wow.
Well, and you know what's funny? You know, and what's funny is what you're hearing. I mean, I'm not going to take credit. I work hard at the drum thing, and I'm better now than I was in 2010 when I had been playing for a year the drums, adding them to the harmonica. What I'll say is that back behind everything I do, clearly, and all of the growth that I've had doing foot drums. I have a foot drum on the left. I'm a lefty, and I've got a kick drum on the left. I've got a sideways snare on the right with a tambourine pedal. But all of that stuff, as you know, because we've had this long conversation before, is really coming through me by way of the man that I played with for many years, and some of your listeners, if they're older, if they're of a certain age, and they were in Harlem in the mid to late 1980s and early 90s, they might have seen me out there, but they certainly would have seen him out there. Sterling McGee, the so-called, he called himself Mr. Satan back then. In fact, that was the only thing I ever called him back then, Mr. Satan. And it's all from him. I mean, it's all to even think that I could do that, right? Play harmonica, amplified harp, and also play drums, and also sing, and not somehow think, well, that's impossible to do all those different things. You can do them. I can't sing and play at the same time, but I can sing and play drums and then play harp. And that, he would do guitar, percussion, vocals. So he actually was doing all three things at the same time. And that I have memories of him. They're like embodied memories at this point. To the point where when I was actually trying to add drums to my thing, I knew that if I couldn't do it right away, I didn't have to worry, because I remember hearing him talk to me as he was doing that himself. He added a second hi-hat. When he did that, he would say, "Man, your feet get confused up here." And then he would, use terms like growth upholdment. It's part of the general growth upholdment of what I'm doing. But he was always about giving it time, letting it happen organically. Let it happen organically. Let it grow, and don't force it. Don't force it. Just keep working at it. He didn't like the word practice. He would say, "You don't practice to be you. You got to exercise." So
right. But, I'm happy you brought that up, because prior to us going into your current project, let's delve into a little bit of the history, because yes, we did discuss Satan and Adam in its early stages and the relationship that cultivated and the inspiration and mentoring. However, Mr. Satan wasn't your first blues mentor out of New York. Wasn't there another gentleman who was pretty big in the New York blues streets, for that matter?
Well,
and this was prior to you meeting Mr. Satan, correct?
Well, absolutely, and that's the curious thing. And I know my story is not unique in its general outlines, which is to say, although I'm 59, at that point I was a young man in his mid to late 20s. A young white man originally from the suburbs, from Rockland County, just north of New York, and but I was I got kind of crazy back into blues after a major heartache, a love relationship that fell apart after 5 years, and I knew the guy that she left me for, the standard kind of heartbreak story.
Right.
And I met a guy named Nat Riddles, who was actually from Bronxville. He'd lived at Co-op City, and he played at a club called Dan Lynch. He had actually accompanied Larry Johnson, the late Larry Johnson, who was one of New York's real treasures on the traditional blues guitar front. Larry was from Georgia, so Nat had his own sort of a mentorship. He played with Odetta. Nat had a lot of what he would say great training.
Odetta.
Yeah, he played with Odetta. He played with So I was mentored by two, you could say I had two African-American elders, but one was just 6 years older and one was 22 years older. And so, yeah, by the time I met Sterling, I had taken what Nat showed me how to do. And I had done my busking myself in the streets of New York with several different guitar players and then gone over to Europe and then come back. So all this is happening kind of in the mid-'80s, 85, 86 is when I met Sterling. And New York was a different place then. You know, when I tried to tell the story of that experience in Mr. Satan's Apprentice, I had to talk about Yusef Hawkins. I had to talk about Howard Beach, because if you were in public out on those streets, there was a lot of bad stuff happening on those streets. And
it sure was.
You know, people these days, when we talk about the Michael Browns of the world, the Eric Garners of the world, African-American men were having a tough time out in Queens, out in Queens and Brooklyn.
Right.
And there I was.
And I mean, for what it's worth, considering I was actually there as well, because I'm from Brooklyn, and one of these instances, the young man who was killed was from my neighborhood and known by my older brother and his friends. These are not these aren't police brutality incidents. These are literally hate crimes that became, for an extreme term, police state events. Because after the hate crime, then the police jumped on our back. You know, a lot of people, some people weren't even born, and then others may forget. But you and I were there, and I remember firsthand.
Yeah, there, and so I was playing on 125th Street, right across from the state office building. There was a New York telephone office at that point, and I had to begin to sense, my position. There had been no overt hostility towards me at all. But after Yusef Hawkins was shot, it felt like the last straw to a lot of people. And Sterling, Mr. Satan, said basically, Mr. Adam, it's nothing between you and me, but you better stay away from Harlem for a week or two because my people are angry. And he sort of felt like he couldn't guarantee my safety. Not that he ever could. Nobody can. And that's sort of the point. And then there was a period after Do the Right Thing came out, which was 1988 or 9. It was one of those. I think it was 89. I think it was 89, and that was the only time that there was ever overt hostility. Two men came up and basically told me that I might not be safe playing out there, and it doesn't matter. They were basically what they were saying, and I realize now they were saying, don't think that white privilege, such as it is in effect. There are some angry people. They're angry young people, and nobody guarantee what will or won't happen. We're talking with that kind of roundabout. It was a threat. It was a threat, but it was a threat that I understood. I had some sense of what it came out of.
I would say it was a forewarning rather than threat, because the times were sensitive. And I have to say this, based on the climate we're in today in America, not just the present, everything that's happening. For most people, for some people, this is new. For others, for some reason, maybe mentally they've been dormant, but this has been going on for a while. You know, and just the fact that maybe 40, 50 years ago, there were still marches for civil rights. So to fast forward to today, you know, a lot of this stuff is still prevalent because it's fresh, unfortunately, but it's fresh, and a lot of people are confused about what's going on today.
Well, you know, one of the things that I was doing during the years between 86 and 91 is I had always been interested in African American literature and history, but I began to read more because I wanted to have a more consciousness about, in effect, the world I was entering. I wanted to understand Harlem better, and I wanted to understand kind of my position, but sort of where people were coming from too. And I remember Martin Luther King. I'm teaching a class down here at Ole Miss, and one of the texts we look at was Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, where moderate, quote-unquote, white religious men in Birmingham basically told him, go slow and don't create disorder. And he said, basically, I'm not creating disorder. What I'm doing is exposing the disorder, if you will, the injustice that's always been there. I'm bringing it to the surface. And I think that may be one thing that's going on. That's sort of what you're saying in some sense, is that disorder, that injustice has been there. And I think, I don't know, a lot of it's the huge expansion of the prison industrial complex. I'm reading Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, these days. Again, teaching Southern Studies. We're giving him hell down at Ole Miss. But I think that injustice may have gone up. When you and I were roughly the same age. I was a child of the mid-'70s as much. That's kind of when I was graduating high school. And that was a time, disco, it was a time when it felt like things were mellowing out a little bit, maybe. People were tired. Even we had a white Southerner in the White House, but he was reasonably cool. With Jimmy Carter, it's like people just were exhausted. But
Jimmy Carter is a different character, and his upbringing, I hate to say this, similar to Elvis, he was exposed to the idea or concept of poor blacks and poor whites having to, or actually not even Elvis, I would say Johnny Cash is a better example. He was exposed to poor whites and poor blacks having to get along to go on. I can't say the same for majority of those who were in office, and I will say disco, drugs, and sex did bring a lot of people together. But on the back streets and different places, these things, the Bronx burning, Harlem and Brooklyn becoming a drug zone where it was affluent black folks living. There's a lot of things that happened that may not have been a physical assault in regards to club upside your head, but the societal assault destroyed our community. However, this is actually a great segue into your book, right? In regards to you stating, the literature that you're reading. Let's talk about this book, Beyond the Crossroads. This is very interesting to me because, I believe that, and I'm working to prove that the blues is in the Bible. Now, you're speaking in regards to Beyond the Crossroads, the devil and the blues tradition. Let's talk about this. Set it up, please.
Sure. So one thing to think about is the title, and the way to set it up is to say it took me about 7 years to research and write the book. And another couple of years to get it published. And when I was in mid-research and I was telling people about the book, I said, I'm writing a book on the devil figure in the blues. And they'd always say two things. The first one would be, that phrase, the devil's music. They'd heard of the phrase, the devil's music. And so that's actually, and I can talk about that, chapter 1 is a deep exploration of that phrase and trying to understand it and how people used it and where it came from and what it meant, who it affected. And the other thing that they would always say, and I would say, honestly, much more your Caucasian blues lover would say, well, Robert Johnson, right? You must be writing about Robert Johnson and the Crossroads and how he sold his soul to the devil, or that mythology, whether they believed it or not, they would invoke that. And I would say, yeah. But the point of the book was actually to get past certainly that specific romanticism. It's not a romantic book. And I grew up, I probably should say, I grew up half Jewish, half Protestant, grew up pretty much unchurched. And I met a guy at a blues conference down here, Eugene Hideaway Bridges, who's a fantastic younger blues man. Younger meaning he's in his early 50s to my late 50s. And he said, "Well, yeah, how could you play?" I told him I played blues. He said, "How can you play the blues if you're not from the church?" Which is an interesting thing to say, but I understand now absolutely what he means, because many of the people I write about, and my book is until the 5th chapter, and that Crossroads stuff where I talk about Clarksdale. My book is it belongs in the African American Studies column. It's primarily about black Southerners with some Northerners involved. And it's a kind of a cultural study. But many of them, John Lee Hooker, Bessie Smith, many of them grew up in the church, and they absorbed all of the biblical sayings about Satan, certainly, and about the devil. And that was part of their given. That was part of what they had. So when a guy like John Lee Hooker, whose father was a Baptist minister, William Hooker, in the Clarksdale area, when he ends up singing a song, "Ain't no heaven, ain't no burning hell, where I go after I die, can't nobody tell," that was actually a revolutionary kind of response. It was an act of resistance against people who would divide the world into good and evil.
That's one of the things that Son House line.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. It's a line. It's the Son House song. I talk about this actually. So the Son House, and if I'm trying to draw on my memory of his version of the song, you're absolutely right. The line shows up in Son House, My Black Mama, I think. And what he's really saying there is, with this woman, I just don't know where I'm going to end up. There's no heaven with her, and and ain't no burning hell. It's like I'm tossed and turned. It was basically more about a woman. The woman's not in John Lee Hooker's version. Right. Really, and so that's one of the. But you're absolutely right, and they all struggled. They struggled with this. So the book's it has 5 chapters. I talk about the devil's music in this, and I can talk about that briefly. I'll just outline it real quick so people have some sense. The 2nd chapter is about the very first It's the very first devil blues. So one of the things I had to do was create a kind of archive of the songs I was going to investigate, and then transcribe them all, which is what I did. And it turned there wasn't an archive. Interestingly enough, I thought there would be. Nobody had done it. I thought, well, I've got to start with that. And the first one, essentially, in the blues tradition that I could find, was 1924, Clara Smith, a song written by Porter Grangerfield, who was a professional black songwriter, I think in New York. And it's called "Done Sold My Soul to the Devil." And there's no crossroads. In fact, one thing you might file away as an insight is part of the problem with all the focus on the crossroads as a location for the devil, or Legba, or Esu and Eshu, is that women are not a part of that crossroads mythology at all. It leaves the women out, but they are there at the founding of the devil blues tradition with this song. And it seems to be a song, the black theologian and blues scholar John Michael Spencer said it was essentially a song about a woman struggling against her pimp, basically. It seems to be a song that does several different things. It's a woman who acknowledges that she's enthralled to the devil. He's given her a lot of gold. He won't leave her alone. He tracks every turn she makes. Could be a pimp, could be a pimp. But she also says, basically, I'm bad. Not bad as in morally fallen, although she does say that. But she says, I'm bad in that I've got a Gatling gun. I drink carbolic acid. I got a Gatling gun. She's sort of a bad woman in the other way, which is to say a figure of forcefulness.
She's nothing to be toyed with, in other words.
Right. Perfect, man. I wish I had that line in the book. She's nothing to be toyed with. Yes.
Well, you know, this is very... It's very interesting. Now, I have that song pulled up, but before we go into that song, this is extremely interesting. on several levels. I'm happy you bring up a shoe. I have a personal friend and fellow musician out here in Goma Hill who does I have a program called Blues Music is Black History. I've recently upgraded that to change the name to African American Tribal Music and the Black Experience, because as this program has progressed and we've done this show on several occasions, more and more traditions out of the heritage or culture come to form from folk, which folk and blues is pretty much the same, but protest songs. A young lady, I can't call her name at the moment. And I feel bad because she was beyond amazing. She is Aboriginal, and she sang Black Indian songs accompanied by a guitar. So it kind of grows. So, but the point I'm making is the fact that he has a song about a shoe, and he goes into a dialogue explaining who a shoe is in regards to this devil at the crossroads. And in fact, a lot of musicians have gone to the crossroads and presented offerings to this entity, that this is actually a fact from Louis Armstrong, even what is this guy, Eric Clapton, went and visited this particular space where this entity is. So it's really it's astonishing and also impressive that you actually added this entity, because the story that Nguma expresses is he's not actually the devil, but a trickster, and what he gives to you is on who you are, right?
Well, that's one of the questions I was trying to resolve. It's really hard to resolve questions when you start dealing with creolization, when you start dealing with several different traditions that have certain parallels kind of beginning to intermix. And so it's clear that the Christian devil, the European devil, shows up in black culture at a certain point through in the what do you call the Great Revival. So the first Great Revival is like in the 1740s with George Whitefield, but in the sort of early part of the 1800s, you had I found again and again stories in which black fiddlers, because the fiddle was the first devil's instrument, threw down the fiddle because they found God. And so you sort of begin to have a division within the African American side of things between people who were sort of committed to that baptism and rebirth, and maybe they've been chased to the door of hell. The WPA narratives have people talking about how they were chased to the door of hell by Satan, and then suddenly they found God, and the hellhounds disappeared, You have that. On the other hand, here's a statistic that surprised me, and I had to get the statistics right. In 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, something like 20 to 25% of African Americans, and let's say black Southerners, 9 out of 10 lived where slavery was. 20 to 25% believed in God, had that Christianized outlook. The other 3/4 did not, partly because they didn't buy the you must obey your master as the Lord kind of construal of Christianity, which some of the masters tried to throw on them. And those are the people who kind of end up. So I had assumed that it was far more than that who would have been Christianized. Maybe because when we think about the Bible Belt, we have to think about black Southerners and all the churches that they built.
Right. And there's two forms of that church, right? And now, here's my question, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Because there are two black churches that stem from this time period, the era of the 1614. We can go from 1400s to the Bible Belt of the turn of the century. There's two black churches that stems from one, right? The Bush, the Bush They didn't. The
hush
bush parties, I believe they called it.
Yeah.
Right now, because you have a group of black folk that were brought here, and then you have another group of black folk that were already here that shared the same spiritual belief, which is the beliefs of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. Then you have the some of them. And then you also have the speaking in tongues and the different things, right?
Well, the whole voodoo conjuration thing is there too, right? Yeah.
Right. Then you have the church that was built by the house Negro, mm-hmm. which their ministry was geared to what the master wanted the non-readers to understand. Mm-hmm. Right. So now, So, were you did you discuss that at all, or was it just more geared in regards to the fact that you had slaves who believed in the spirituals, and then slaves who believed in the slave secular, who did not prescribe or subscribe to the missionaries of European descent?
Well, one of the things I did is I realized pretty quickly that if you're going to write about the devil in the blues tradition, you obviously have to go back further than the moment, blues is starting to show up on record or show up as a folk form, right? At the moment it's starting to show up in blues lyrics. You have to go back. And one thing I found, I actually would love to flip the book open and just read something. One thing I did is I went back and I looked at the spirituals, and I made an argument. In one chapter, I make an argument that there is a subset of blues songs in which the devil is a screen figure for evil Southern whiteness, for the white man.
Right.
And that this is something that's inherited from the spirituals. And if you go back and look at the spirituals, it's really easy to find a series of verses in which what seems in every reasonable way, it seems that we're talking about the paterrollers, we're talking about the people who are coming after you. Satan is somebody who's going to wrestle you to the ground. He's somebody who's going to bind you. There's just a kind of physicality to the way that Satan is imaged, or the devil, excuse me. The devil is imaged in the spirituals that I think is relevant. I'm trying to sort of page through my book. I wish I could find that, and I will find it. So I look at verses like. Old Satan told me to my face, I'll get you when you leave this place. Oh, brother, that scared me to my heart. I was feared to walk when it was dark. So there's a way in which the sort of standard narrative of a soul being leery of the devil out in public space gets magnified, I think, by the way in which to be a slave was to be somebody who had the hell patrolled out of them, if you will, the moment they got off that plantation. I started home, but I did pray, and I met old Satan on the way. Old Satan made a one grab at me, but he missed my soul, and I went free. So I went back and I looked at that stuff, but then something very interesting happens in the period that I'm looking at, the period between, let's say, 1885 and 1920, or 1925. Okay. Let's just take that 40-year period. Let's think about. So one thing that happens is that you have obviously the founding of the historically black colleges and universities, but you also have the building of the black churches, black Christians.
The mega churches, for that matter.
What's that?
I said the initial mega churches, for that matter.
The initial mega churches, yeah. And so if you're an African-American man in the South with ambition, one of the few places where you can really preside and build in a big way and go overseas with overseas missions is to be a minister in charge of sort of, and even higher up in the ecclesiastical kind of hierarchy, kind of in charge of one of these churches. At the same time that that's happening, it was men in charge of it. Women were not allowed. It took a long time for any of these denominations, whether it's AME, CME, COGIC, it took a long time for any of them to let women have positions of authority. But it was almost entirely male ministers, and you had women who were sort of within. But at the same time that people are doing this, you have a younger generation. And Hooker, William Hooker with his son John Lee Hooker is a classic example. You have a younger generation and W.C. Handy is sort of an earlier version of this. You have a younger generation of Southern black folk who say, this world of entertainment is also a place where I can go and I can be creative. and I can
absolutely,
and I can rise up and I can wear nice clothes. Handy's a good example of that. He becomes father of the blues, but his father was a minister and his grandfather was a minister. So there again, you get a younger generation. So you get a tension. In fact, it becomes an explosive tension between a parental generation committed to building churches and a child's generation, the children who are committed to living out their freedom as they see fit. And for many of them, that was in the world of entertainment. There's one thing I didn't put in my book, but this was a very key, it offered me a key insight from a key elder around here. Mr. Johnny Billington, he's passed away now, but he was in his mid-70s back in 2008 or 9 it was. When he came to Oxford, he's a man about 6'3" in a pinstriped suit. He looked like a blues man, which is what he was. And he was the guy who taught Chris Stone, Kingfish Ingram at the Delta Blues Museum and a lot of other younger musicians. He was the blues teacher. And I said, Mr. Johnny, he came and we were actually playing on the street. And at one point I paused and I said, Mr. Johnny, I've heard a lot of talk about how blues is the devil's music. And he went, no. He just held out his finger and stopped me dead. And he looked in my eye and he said the following. And I wrote it down because it was amazing. He said, by the time that minister gets his hand on $1, the blues man has had 2 chances at it. And I thought about that. And I knew the answer right away. I said, Friday night and Saturday night. He said, yes. So for him, the what I call the devil's music dispute, for him, it was primarily about money. It was primarily about, from the perspective of the ministers. But there's some truth to this, and my book digs deeply into this. From the perspective of the ministers who were trying to build their churches, the blues man is encouraging parishioners and potential parishioners not just to, listen to music that is accompanied by fornication and bad language and alcohol and all of the things that are proscribed, right? But if they're spending money, they're throwing nickels and dimes. Honey Boy Edwards said they're throwing nickels and dimes. And churches were not rolling in cash in Mississippi, say, in the year 1920. Here's something else that never occurred to me until I began this project. What did the Great Migration do to black churches in the Delta? Well, I went and did some original research in the Methodist Archive. There's a number of black Methodist organizations in Mississippi, so this is not AME or CME, this is just the Mississippi Methodists. And I found a guy who oversaw the entire Clarksdale district, 6 counties around Clarksdale, basically, Coahoma County and 6 other counties. And he comes in 1917 and says the Delta is this land of infinite promise for the religious man, basically. He says we're going to build churches, we're going to make money, we're going to send more money overseas to our overseas missions. And then that's 1917. Great Black Migration is in full swing at that point, and he doesn't realize that. And he comes in every year and he goes, some of our churches are distressed in a profound way. The ministers are low on morale. Nobody respects them, because that was another thing I discovered, is that young people in the Delta, according to 3 different sociologists, especially Charles Spurgeon Johnson, who has an essay in the New Negro back in 26.
Right.
He says basically the most cynical young black people in the South are in the Mississippi Delta. They think ministers. So when I get Johnny Billington, who's 75 now, but he would have been a young person, probably the son. Maybe he would have been one of those young people back then, 50 years ago, back in the 30s. Well, he would have been 10 maybe. But the point is, there's a lot of cynicism, and the ministers it was being inflicted on them in a range of ways. And one of my premises is that phrase, the devil's music, is partly an outgrowth of feeling as though on the part of the ministers that they were being attacked in various ways by things that looked like they clumped onto the blues, that idea of restlessness, the idea that money competition, status competition. There was clearly some status anxiety that they felt as they were watching their congregations sort of dissolve overnight in some cases. So that was one of the things that I evoke, and there's a lot of other things, but I call the devil's music dispute.
Okay, well, money does, and to this day, plays a big part in why people of all backgrounds and ethnicities, but I can speak specifically for the so-called African American, has issue or concern with the church. Money's always played a big issue when you see different things. But what I would like to ask, based on what you mentioned, as well as something that you mentioned, but I don't want to say skipped over. That just wasn't the bulk of your point. Could it be? And we're not talking about those who were in position that were trying to make their church a big business. Just the regular storefront church that, for the most part, in my experience and study, they really are on a mission to save souls. Could it be that a lot of the people that were attending church and looking for salvation or counseling, more importantly, and I say more importantly, not to disregard or minimize the saving of souls, but a lot of people were looking for counseling because in these juke houses, juke joints, and hut parties and cabin parties, they were finding their women being promiscuous with different men, or they were finding their husband there being promiscuous with different women. People were getting cut up and shot, and it was actually hurting the community rather than helping build. Could that be one of the reasons? Or did you discuss that, actually, more importantly?
Well, I do a little bit when I talk about, it's interesting. I think it was Charles Johnson who sort of did a class analysis of, the Delta or that area, and had there was a sort of minuscule upper class, a pretty small middle class, and then four sort of increasingly low down groups of working class people. And the lowest, he said, were what he called the free people, which included sort of the people who didn't have a job and because they were hustling, right? And included the bluesmen, it included the women of the night, it included the juke joint owners, I guess. It included anybody connected with that nighttime world, the numbers runners, and he called them the free people. But he also said they were the ones where the men tended to be most possessive. So there was a kind of sexual license, which is again a playing out of freedom. I think we need to understand. But there were some violent men, and that's where the bad man, I would say some of the bad man ballads come out of that. And I think that, blues songs, some blues songs I looked at, men say, I am the devil, and configured themselves as devils. And they're not particularly, in that case, they're not endorsing any kind of spiritual values at all. There are other songs which we have to talk about, like Bessie Smith's The Devil's Gonna Get You, where you have blues people invoking the devil very much the way a religious person might. But I think you're right. One of the compassionate ways of looking at it. A good example. I just want to tell you the brief story that I like to tell about John Lee Hooker's family, because the most compassionate way of looking at it is after the long nightmare of slavery, where it was impossible to sort of maintain control over a household. Let's just say. Very difficult. There were a few free black people, obviously, in Charleston and elsewhere, but by and large, it was impossible. Suddenly, one of the things you've got here are the churches incoming. You've got religion, and you've got your household. You've got your family. There were things preying on that. There were in the South. One thing I talk about is sort of the white men who strayed across the tracks, and black blues players in some cases seemed to have a rage and conjure a rage about that sort of thing, because obviously they weren't allowed to steal across the tracks and take a white woman, although I talk about that too in a chapter involving Big Bill Brunzi. Control, finally. You finally got a margin of control, and along comes the blues. And of course, somebody like W.C. Handy's father, who when he brings home a guitar, he says, that's the devil, get rid of that. He makes him sell it to get a dictionary. It makes sense that the parents thought, like, basically, Christ, finally we have a chance to run a household the way we'd like to run a household, and here comes this music that's pulling our kids away from us. They're getting modern on us. That was a term that shows up again and again. They're getting modern. In fact, that's a phrase that a woman in Clarksdale uses in 1940 when John W. Work comes and interviews people. She says, the young people these days, they're not behaving right. They drink, they stay out till all hours of the morning. I'm going to call them the new rising devil class. Why that, right? Because they're all just raising the devil all the time. In other words, the devil sometimes shows up as parents and elders saying, I just wish I just wish they'd calm down a little instead of running riot, right? So young people experiencing freedom, but older people are trying to maintain control. It's an age-old thing. It was. I would say that the devil shows up in the blues tradition, not infrequently, somehow born tied up in all of that. If that makes sense. But you're absolutely right.
I do understand. Let me ask you this, because you also mentioned we spoke about the business of the church and the gentleman who was the head of many districts and things of this nature, and you also mentioned the New Negro, right? Because at the time of the New Negro, which was pretty much immediately after Reconstruction, or we can even say during, for that matter, there was this moment of, or beginning of this upper echelon of the so-called African American, right? So now you have the early documentation of class. And I say early documentation because there were many free blacks that had businesses, thriving businesses, right? But and there was free blacks that started churches in the North, but we're talking about the Mason-Dixie, the antebellum South, which was just hell in its own right. So we have this new Negro, and most of the upper echelon was the doctors, the lawyers, the quote-unquote intellectuals. Also, the head of these initial versions of mega churches. So now we have a class divide. And it sounds like you're speaking about that to a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point. Is that from the parents? So there's yes, for the first time there, if you will, black people are free to kind of develop class sensitivity and class stratification, and you have the talented 10th sort of happening, and you have people in dressed like they're Victorians, they're good Victorians. That's why Plessy v. Ferguson comes in and says basically, you can't ride on the streetcars. It's not about the so-called criminal Negro. We all know that. It's about the opposite. It's about the people who are doing really well, and white Southerners get their feelings hurt and say, no, we're going to beat you back down. So you get that class thing, yes. And so I think from that perspective, blues is low down. Zora Neale Hurston talk about the shoddy confines of the juke joint. It's low down, earthy. It's people's culture. And from the standpoint of an emergent middle class or black bourgeoisie, and Leroy Jones talks about this in Blues People. I guess it's a problem. It's dissipation, right? When you should be saving, you're spending. And we can think about B.B. King singing, "Hey everybody, let's have some fun." You have to spend some cash, right? I mean that there's a sort of don't save but spend kind of ethos to the blues sometimes. You've been working all day. It's time to sort of let your hair down and
have a good time.
And have a good time. And the blues musicians knew how to, to capitalize on that. Honeyboo Edwards.
Well, they had to. That was their job. You're a busker if you're a blind performer. Now, let me ask you this.
Sure.
Because we spoke about a lot of theories and hypotheses or situations where the devil and the blues are prevalent in regards to, well, maybe it's, this, that, and the third. However, in a lot of these songs, right, they speak about witchcraft, voodoo, mojo hand. I'm going down to see the local witch doctor to put a hex on this woman so she can want me. Did you address that? And is that part of the separation between the church and the blues?
Well, it's a great question. I obviously, what my book is not, it's not a study. It's not a complete study. It's only incidentally a study of hoodoo and voodoo. And I'd recommend, if somebody was interested in that, the best book that I came across was Katrina Hazard Donald's book. I forget what the title is, but it's like the old hoodoo, the old Southern hoodoo something. It has the word old in the title. She also wrote a book called Jukin, which is about the emergence of the juke joint. But it's what she does is historicize hoodoo, and they help me understand a few things. What I would say is that so in this antebellum period, the slavery period, Satan is often associated with conjure. Don't let him conjure you.
Right.
Where does that come from? Well, that may come from white Christian, people who are coming in and saying that heathenish stuff that they're talking about. God is not about that stuff. This is a different God. There's some interplay, and that stuff keeps alive. One intervention that I make. Here's one thing I found. People will sometimes talk about Robert Johnson, and they'll mention hot foot powder, put hot foot powder all around your door. There are invocations of hoodoo stuff in Johnson. One of the more controversial claims that I make, and I base it on a couple of different things, is that there's no particular reason to think that Johnson, when he invoked hoodoo, necessarily believed in it. And again, here I go to the three sociologists who wrote about young African American people in the South and specifically in the Delta: John Dollard, Hortense Powdermaker, and Charles Johnson. And all of them said this generation they're not, they don't believe in hell. That was number one, is they don't believe in hell. They don't believe in hellfire and brimstone. They're incapable of they're skeptical. They're modern. Right. They're incapable of being scared by the stuff that their parents want to be able to scare them with to keep them in line. And Johnny Shine said the same thing. Johnny Shine said, yeah, my father believed in all that crap. I don't even think he used the word crap, but he's all that foolishness. He says he was an educated man, but he believed in that, and he meant hoodoo. So Johnny Shines, Robert Johnson are of a generation where my claim is that, and this puts me face to face against Julio Finn in The Blues Man, where he says Johnson must have visited a hoodoo doctor and known how to do that stuff. My argument is, now he wasn't from the Delta, Johnson, but he was through there a lot, and he was definitely on the cutting edge attitudinally. And my argument is that he's a cynic. He is, and here's one. This is actually a really important takeaway point in the book. When I talk about Robert Johnson, I go and I begin with some important, relatively recent research by a guy named Bruce Conforth. Bruce Conforth went and found the family of Ike Zimmerman. Ike Zimmerman has a Jewish name, but he's an African-American guitar player who turns out to be 12 years older than Johnson, not 4. I made that mistake because Conforth changed things. But Conforth went and found his daughter, who said, Robert Johnson came and lived with us. He was protected by my father. The word protege means protect, the protected one. Right. Zimmerman was Johnson's mentor and master, if you will, the master musician who taught him what he knew. But Zimmerman, the family lived across the street from a graveyard. And the daughter said, my dad used to go and practice in the graveyard. And when Robert came, they'd practice there. Now, in the past, when scholars have mentioned Zimmerman at all, they basically say, yeah, he was associated with graveyards, and they make it sound like he was potentially an evil, magical guy. But this is what Zimmerman's daughter said. She said, my dad did not go to the crossroads. He went across the road. He went to that graveyard. He'd get peace and quiet. But when he'd come home, we'd say, Dad, where you been? And he'd say, I've been playing for the Haints. Right? I've been playing for the evil spirits. And then we'd all have a big laugh because everybody thought, well, I think that Zimmerman was joking. I think he was trying to spook them. The way you tell kids a ghost story, boo. And I think my argument is that what Robert Johnson got from Zimmerman, apart from incredible technique, was that attitude of, you know what, people are going to project whatever they want onto us. We may even be able to use it to our advantage, but we know what we were doing in that graveyard. You were teaching me how to really throw down.
Well, let me ask you this as we come to the close of the live broadcast. Just out of curiosity, because I know Robert Johnson did start in the church, and I was a little surprised because I don't know of a quote-unquote black musician that did not start in the church. In my short life, I do not, because they go hand in hand. But I want to ask you about, do you think a lot of these thoughts or what's the word, superstitions were passed to the so-called African American by the European? Because you've mentioned that in so many words. Because conjuring starts in Africa.
Yeah.
They conjured spirits all the time. So I would have to believe if there's one side of the story, there's another side. Do you think that the fear of this or the thought of the devil and God came from Europe to African Americans?
Man, these are great questions. They're large questions.
I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I see two streams intersecting, and part of what that does is it means that, well, it creates errors in certain places. So, for example, I argue against the blues scholars Paul Oliver and Paul Guerin. Paul Guerin's very famous for saying, the blues was evil. This is what John Michael Spencer takes him to task for. He says white blues scholars don't get it. He says it's not as though you got blues people here who are completely amoral and unchurched, and then you got God's people here. He says there's a category in the middle called the somewhat religious. He goes, a lot of blues people, at minimum, fall into that category, which is to say, and you can quote any number of them. John Lee Hooker, a good example, grew up in the church. He didn't sort of put it aside. What he did was he was skeptical about some of the dogma that was imposed on him. But a lot of blues musicians say, well, the church just didn't want me, but it didn't mean that I wasn't godly, right? Honey Boy Edwards said, my talent came from God. So that's clearly something I wanted to show. In no way did I want to be sensationalistic and say the people who sang these songs were not only the sort of lowest of the low, but they were, the devil's role. It's just a way of being nasty and a way of saying I'm bad. There were some songs like that. But there are songs like The Devil's Gonna Get You by Bessie Smith, as I've said, where she's basically saying, you've been away for weeks, you come home, you've been whoring around, and you turn your back on me. It's like RESPECT, but back in, 28. She's basically saying, you're disrespecting me sexually. The devil's gonna get you, just as sure as you're born. He's going to take you down below. She's talking like a church woman in a sense, although I guess vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So she's poaching on that a little bit, but she's saying basically, you've been evil. You've been a kind of devil, and you're going to go and join him. She's certainly not trying to depict herself as bad. Now, she does have, of course, Send Me to the Electric Chair, where she says basically, I want to join the devil down below, because she's killed a man who was really bad to her. And feels no remorse. So if there's a takeaway point, the devil's not one thing. The devil in the blues is not just one thing. The devil's a shapeshifter. The devil is many streams of culture come together in the devil, including stuff that predates Christianity, certainly. And then there's the whole African side. And, of course, Africa's different cultures, different localized cultures. But there were a lot of people who ended up in Louisiana, as we know, came from regions where there was a lot of conjuring going on.
Absolutely.
I wish I could give you firm answers, but all I can do is say...
No, those are good answers. In the last 2 minutes, what I would like you to do is explain to the audience what is it you would like them to take away from this piece of literature and the songs that you present in this literature.
Well, I'm going to tell you the song. So when Robert Johnson could not make the Spirituals to Swing concert in New York, Hammond tried to find him. Big Bill Brunzi was his sub because Johnson had been killed. So Big Bill Brunzi comes and sings and plays. I would like people, not that I don't think Johnson's important, but I would like people to go and I'd like them to listen to Big Bill Brunzi's song, Hell Ain't But a Mile and a Quarter. Because the way that I talk about that song is I say it is, in effect, it's a way of talking about what it was like to be in the Jim Crow South, what it was like to cross the tracks. Hell ain't but a mile and a quarter. Hell is right there. And when you get there, they'll give you brimstone for water. Do I think he's singing in a moment when we had white and colored water fountains? Do I think he's signifying that? No. But then he says, when you get there, you'll have to obey the devil's orders. And then he says, now the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to marry the devil's daughter. The devil's son-in-law, Petey Wheatstraw, is the man who marries the devil's daughter. If the devil's the white man, as I believe some blues songs configure him, then the man who marries the devil's daughter.
Well, some spirituals do that as well.
Do they? Yeah, well, yes, but I think that the blues draws on. So there, you can find a pattern of folk tales and stuff that talk about the devil's daughter.
Right.
I think that the bluesmen know, and Big Bill Brunsey grew up in Jim Crow, Arkansas, not Mississippi, Arkansas, and he saw a serviceman get lynched, or a man in his town got lynched for not stepping off the sidewalk when the white woman came by. So when he's saying, and he carried clippings about Emmett Till, so Brunsey was incredibly conscious of his vulnerable position and the position of people like him in the South. And I think that he's signifying. And when he says, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to marry the devil's daughter, you may think it's a long way, but hell ain't but a mile and a quarter. I think he's saying it's right there for anybody who would be so bold. So that's what I'd like to do, is think a little deeper about the lyrics. Yeah.
Okay, so the book is basically more in regards of the lyrics that address this conversation of the blues and the devil and the crossroads.
Well, it's all about the lyrics, but it's also all about the cultural history that will help you make sense of the lyrics. And then finally, in the 5th chapter, I talk about the city of Clarksdale. I talk about basically white folks coming in and reifying this idea of a crossroads, which is a spiritual concept, obviously, but reifying it and making it cultural capital. But I tell an interesting story about a white elder near Clarksdale who is a shop teacher who ends up designing and building by himself this monument. So if people Google Crossroads Clarksdale, they'll find this monument. And I talk about the Italian-American guy who went and designed it in a kind of interesting sort of back and forth between the state of Mississippi and the city of Clarksdale. The state actually tried to prevent them from installing it because the state wanted to control the highways. So crossroads take all shapes, but that's what I do. That's what I do at the end. So there's cultural history and a lot of interviews there and a lot of blues tourism stuff. I try to cover pretty much everything. I put everything on the table. This is not the final word, but it's a big book, and it puts a whole lot on the table that wasn't previously there, and I hope people will read it and make use of it in whatever way seems fit.
Listen, I dig it. I'm excited. I'm happy that you took this lengthy and very, what's the word I'm looking for, ambitious job and put on your shoulders and did it. Thanks a lot. Thanks,
man. And thanks for letting us chat at length and going where we went in the early part of this and moving back to where we went in the later part. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
No problem. Well, you're always a welcome recurring guest. So I guess in a few we would have to come back and discuss, if not the songs in detail, the responses that you're getting.
Well, I'd love to. I still don't have a review yet on Amazon, although it's for sale out there. It's on the University of North Carolina Press, and you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore. But I want to know what people think. I'm happy to argue and learn. So.
All right. Thank you, sir, yet again for being on the show.
All right, man. I got to scram. I'll see you next time. Thanks.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right, man. Bye-bye.
Bye. Great show. Great interview. Check out the book. Get the book. Read it. Let's keep celebrating the blues. Let's continue to search, research, and just find some answers. This is Jack Dapper Blues of Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Radio. We will be on air tomorrow. Matter of fact, tomorrow I'll be speaking with Larry Hoffman. And if you don't know who he is, which I'm sure you do, you're going to find out tomorrow. Have a good day, folks.